Costs of production. Among the crucial factors in prices and profits are the costs of producing whatever goods or services are being sold. Not everyone is equally efficient in production, and not everyone's circumstances offer equal opportunities to achieve lower costs. Unfortunately, costs are misconceived almost as much as profits. Economies of scale. First of all, there is no such thing as the cost of producing a given product or service. Henry Ford proved long ago that the cost of producing an automobile was very different when you produced 100 cars a year than when you produced 100,000. He became the leading automobile manufacturer in the early 20th century by pioneering mass production methods in his factories, revolutionizing not only his own company, but business throughout the economy, which followed the mass production principles that he introduced. The time required to produce a Ford Model T chassis shrank from 12 man-hours to an hour and a half. With a mass market for automobiles, it paid to invest in expensive but labor-saving mass production machinery, whose cost per car would turn out to be modest when spread out over a huge number of automobiles. But if there were only half as many cars sold as expected, then the cost of machinery per car would be twice as much. Large fixed costs are among the reasons for lower costs of production per unit of output as the amount of output increases. Lower costs per unit of output as the number of units increases is what economists call economies of scale. It has been estimated that the minimum amount of automobile production required to achieve the fullest economies of scale today runs into the hundreds of thousands of cars per year. Back at the beginning of the 20th century, the largest automobile manufacturer in the United States produced just 6 cars a day. At that level of output, the cost of production was so high that only the truly rich could afford to buy a car. But Henry Ford's mass production methods brought the cost of producing cars down within the price range of ordinary Americans. Moreover, he continued to improve the efficiency of his factories. The price of a Model T Ford was cut in half between 1910 and 1916. Similar principles apply in other industries. It does not cost as much to deliver 100 cartons of milk to one supermarket as it does to deliver 10 cartons of milk to each of 10 different neighborhood stores scattered around town. Economies in beer production include advertising. Although Anheuser-Busch spends millions of dollars a year advertising Budweiser and its other beers, its huge volume of sales means that its advertising cost per barrel of beer is less than that of its competitors, Coors and Miller. Such savings add up, permitting larger enterprises to have either lower prices or larger profits or both. Small retail stores have long had difficulty surviving in competition with large chain stores charging lower prices, whether A&P in the first half of the 20th century, Sears in the second half, or Walmart in the 21st century. The higher cost per unit in the smaller stores will not permit them to charge prices as low as the big chain stores' prices. Advertising has sometimes been depicted as simply another cost added on to the cost of producing goods and services. However, insofar as advertising causes more of the advertised product to be sold, economies of scale can reduce production costs so that the same product may cost less when it is advertised rather than more. Advertising itself, of course, has costs, both in the financial sense and in the sense of using resources. But it is an empirical question, rather than a foregone conclusion, whether the costs of advertising are greater or less than the reductions of production costs made possible by the economies of scale which it promotes. This can obviously vary from one firm or industry to another. Diseconomies of scale. Economies of scale are only half the story. If economies of scale were the whole story, the question would then have to be asked, why not produce cars in even more gigantic enterprises? If General Motors, Ford, and Chrysler all merged together, would they not be able to produce cars even more cheaply, and thereby make more sales and profit than when they produce separately? Probably not. There comes a point in every business beyond which the cost of producing a unit of output no longer declines as the amount of production increases. In fact, costs per unit actually rise after an enterprise becomes so huge that it is difficult to monitor and coordinate, when the right hand may not always know what the left hand is doing. Footnote. A book of mine was reviewed in the New York Times on 2 consecutive days by 2 different people, one favorably and the other unfavorably, apparently because the weekly edition and the Sunday edition were under 2 different departments. End footnote. Back in the 1960s, when the American Telephone and Telegraph Company was the largest corporation in the world, its own chief executive officer put it this way: AT&T is so big that if you gave it a kick in the behind today, it would be 2 years before the head said, ouch. In a survey of banks around the world in 2006, The Economist magazine reported their tendency to keep growing larger and the implications of this for lower levels of efficiency. Management will find it harder and harder to aggregate and summarize everything that is going on in the bank, opening the way to the duplication of expense, the neglect of concealed risks, and the failure of internal controls. In other words, the risks inherent in banking may well be under control as far as the top management is aware, but somewhere in their sprawling financial empire, there may be transactions being made that expose the bank to risks that the top management is unaware of. Unknown to the top management at an international bank's New York headquarters, some bank officials at a branch in Singapore may be making transactions that create not only financial risks, but risks of criminal prosecution. This is not a problem peculiar to banks or to the United States. As a professor at the London Business School put it, some organizations have reached a scale and complexity that made risk management errors almost inevitable, while others had become so bureaucratic and top-heavy that they had lost the capacity to respond to changing market demands. Smaller rivals may be able to respond faster because their decision-makers do not have to go through so many layers of bureaucracy to get approval for their actions. During General Motors' long tenure as the largest manufacturer of motor vehicles in the world, its cost of production per car was estimated to be hundreds of dollars more than the costs of Ford, Chrysler, or leading Japanese manufacturers. Problems associated with size can affect quality as well as price. Among hospitals, for example, surveys suggest that smaller and more specialized hospitals are usually safer for patients than large hospitals treating a wide range of maladies. Economies of scale and diseconomies of scale can exist simultaneously in the same business at various levels of output. That is, there may be some things that a given company could do better if it were larger, and other things that it could do better if it were smaller. As an entrepreneur in India put it, what small companies give up in terms of financial clout, technological resources, and staying power, they gain in flexibility, lack of bureaucracy, and speed of decision-making. People in charge of a company's operations in Calcutta may decide what needs to be done to improve business in that city, but if they then have to also convince the top management at the company's headquarters in New Delhi, their decisions cannot be put into operation as quickly or perhaps as fully, and sometimes the people in New Delhi may not understand the situation in Calcutta well enough to approve a decision that makes sense to the people who live there. With increasing size, eventually the diseconomies begin to outweigh the economies, so it does not pay a firm to expand beyond that point. That is why industries usually consist of a number of firms instead of one giant super-efficient monopoly. In the Soviet Union, where there was a fascination with economies of scale and a disregard of diseconomies of scale, both its industrial and agricultural enterprises were the largest in the world. The average Soviet farm, for example, was 10 times the size of the average American farm and employed more than 10 times as many workers. But Soviet farms were notoriously inefficient. Among the reasons for this inefficiency cited by Soviet economists was deficient coordination. One example may illustrate a general problem. In the vast common fields, fleets of tractors fanned out to begin the plowing. Plan fulfillment was calculated on the basis of hectares worked. and so it was to the driver's advantage to cover as much territory as quickly as possible. The drivers started by cutting deep furrows around the edges of the field. As they moved deeper into the field, however, they began to lift the blade of the plow and race the tractor, and the furrows became progressively shallower. The first furrows were 9 to 10 inches deep. A little farther from the road, and they were 5 to 6 inches deep, and in the center of the field, where the tractor drivers were certain that no one would check on them, the furrows were as little as 2 inches deep. Usually no one discovered that the furrows were so shallow in the middle of the field until it became obvious that something was wrong from the stunted nature of the crop. Once again, counterproductive behavior from the standpoint of the economy was not irrational behavior from the standpoint of the person engaging in it. Clearly, the tractor drivers understood that their work could be more easily monitored at the edge of a field than in the center, and they adjusted the kind and quality of work they did accordingly, so as to maximize their own pay based on how much land they plowed. By not plowing as deeply into the ground where they could not be easily monitored by farm officials, tractor drivers were able to go faster and cover more ground in a given amount of time, even if they covered it less effectively. No such behavior would be likely by a farmer plowing his own land in a market economy, because his actions would be controlled by the incentive of profit rather than by external monitors. The point at which the disadvantages of size begin to outweigh the advantages differs from one industry to another. That is why restaurants are smaller than steel mills. A well-run restaurant usually requires the presence of an owner with sufficient incentives to continuously monitor the many things necessary for successful operation, in a field where failures are all too common. Not only must the food be prepared to suit the tastes of the restaurant's clientele, the waiters and waitresses must do their jobs in a way that encourages people to come back for another pleasant experience, and the furnishing of the restaurant must also be such as to meet the desires of the particular clientele that it serves. These are not problems that can be solved once and for all. Food suppliers must be continuously monitored to see they are still sending the kind and quality of produce, fish, meats, and other ingredients needed to satisfy the customers. Cooks and chefs must also be monitored to see that they are continuing to meet existing standards, as well as adding to their repertoires as new foods and drinks become popular and old ones are ordered less often by the customers. The normal turnover of employees also requires the owner to be able to select, train, and monitor new people on an ongoing basis. Moreover, changes outside the restaurant, in the kind of neighborhood around it, for example, can make or break its business. All these factors, and more, must be kept in mind, weighed by the owner, and continuously adjusted to, if the business is to survive, much less be profitable. Such a spectrum of details, requiring direct personal knowledge and control by someone on the scene, and with incentives going beyond a fixed salary, limits the size of restaurants as compared to the size of steel mills, automobile factories, or mining companies. Even where there are nationwide restaurant chains, often these are run by individual owners operating with franchises from some national organization that supplies such things as advertising and general guidance and standards, leaving the numerous on-site monitoring tasks to local owners. Howard Johnson pioneered in restaurant franchising in the 1930s, supplying half the capital with the local manager supplying the other half. This gave the local franchisee a vested interest in the restaurant's profitability, rather than simply a fixed salary for his time. Costs and capacity. Costs vary not only with the volume of output and to varying degrees from one industry to another, they also vary according to the extent to which existing capacity is being used. In many industries and enterprises, capacity must be built to handle the peak volume, which means that there is excess capacity at other times. The cost of accommodating more users of the product or service during the times when there is excess capacity is much less than the cost of handling those who are served at peak times. A cruise ship, for example, must receive enough money from its passengers to cover not only such current costs as paying the crew, buying food, and using fuel, it must also be able to pay such overhead costs as the purchase price of the ship and the expenses at the headquarters of the cruise line. To handle twice as many passengers on a given cruise at the peak season may require buying another ship, as well as hiring another crew and buying twice as much food and fuel. However, if the number of passengers in the off-season is only 1/3 of what it is at the peak, then a doubling of the number of off-season passengers need not require buying another ship. Existing ships can simply sail with fewer empty cabins. Therefore, it pays the cruise line to try to attract economy-minded passengers by offering much reduced fares during the off-season. Groups of retired people, for example, can usually schedule their cruises at any time of the year, not being tied down to the vacation schedules of jobs, and usually not having young children, whose school schedules would limit their flexibility. It is common for seniors to get large discounts in off-season travel, both on land and at sea. Businesses in general can afford to do this because their costs are lower in the off-season, and each particular business is forced to do it because its competitors will take customers away otherwise. Excess capacity can also result from over-optimistic building, because of what Wall Street Journal called an ill-timed building frenzy in luxury ships. Luxury cruise lines added more than 4,000 new berths in a little over a year during the early 21st century. When they found that there was no such demand as to fill all the additional cabins at their existing prices, the net result was that Crystal Cruises, for example, offered their usual $2,995 cruise through the Panama Canal for $1,695, and Seabourn Cruise Line cut the price of its Caribbean cruise from $4,495 to $1,999. They would hardly have done this unless the pressure of competition left them no choice, and unless their incremental costs, when they had excess capacity, were lower than their reduced prices. Unutilized capacity can cause price anomalies in many sectors of the economy. In Cancun, Mexico, the cheapest room available at the modest Best Western Hotel there was $180 a night in mid-2001, while the more luxurious Ritz-Carlton nearby was renting rooms for $169 a night. The Best Western happened to be filled up, and the Ritz-Carlton happened to have vacancies. Nor was this peculiar to Mexico. A 4-star hotel in Manhattan was renting rooms for less than a 2-star hotel nearby, and the posh Phoenician in Phoenix was renting rooms for less than the Holiday Inn in the same city. Why were normally very expensive hotels renting rooms for less than hotels that were usually much lower in price? Again, the key was the utilization of capacity. Tourists going to popular resorts on limited budgets had made reservations at the low-cost hotels well in advance in order to be sure of finding something affordable. This means that fluctuations in the number of tourists would be absorbed by the higher-priced hotels. A general decline in tourism in 2001 thus led to vacancies at the luxury hotels, which then had no choice but to cut prices in order to attract more people to fill their rooms. Thus, the luxurious Boca Raton Resort and Spa in Florida gave guests their third night free, and tourists were able to get last-minute bargains on luxurious beachfront villas at Hilton Head, South Carolina, where reservations usually had to be made 6 months in advance. Conversely, a rise in tourism would also have more effect on luxury hotels, which could raise their prices even more than usual. After 3 consecutive years of declining profits, hotels in 2004 began yanking the discounts, as the Wall Street Journal put it, when increased travel brought more guests. The luxury hotels' reaction took the form of both price increases, $545 a night for the smallest and cheapest room at the Four Seasons Hotel in New York, and elimination of various free extras. It's already tougher this year for families to find the offers of free breakfasts and other perks that business hotels have been freely distributing for the past 3 years in an effort to fill empty beds. Because prices can vary so widely for the same room in the same hotel, according to whether or not there is excess capacity, auxiliary businesses have been created to direct travelers where they can get the best deals on a given day. Priceline and Travelocity being examples of such businesses that have sprung up to match bargain hunters with hotels that have unexpected vacancies. Since all these responses to excess capacity are due to incentives created by the prospect of profits, and the threat of losses in a market economy. The same principles do not apply where the government provides a good or service and charges for it. There are few incentives for government officials to match prices with costs, and sometimes they charge more to those who create the least cost. When a bridge, for example, is built, or its capacity is expanded, the costs created are essentially the cost of building the capacity to handle rush hour traffic. The cars that drive across the bridge between the morning and evening rush hours cost almost nothing because the bridge has idle capacity during those hours. Yet, when tolls are charged, often there are books of tickets or electronic passes available at lower prices per trip than the prices charged to those who drive across the bridge only occasionally during off-peak hours. Although it is the regular rush hour users who create the huge costs of building or expanding a bridge's capacity, they pay less because it is they who are more numerous voters and whose greater stake in toll policies makes them more likely to react politically to toll charges. What may seem like economic folly can be political prudence on the part of politically appointed officials operating the bridges and trying to protect their own jobs. The net economic result is that there is more bridge traffic during rush hours than if different tolls reflected costs at different times of day. Higher rush hour tolls would provide incentives for some drivers to cross the bridge either earlier or later than the rush hours. In turn, that would mean that the amount of capacity required to handle rush hour traffic would be less, reducing costs in both money terms and in terms of the use of scarce resources, which have alternative uses. Passing on costs and saving. It is often said that businesses pass on whatever additional costs are placed on them, whether these costs are placed on them by higher taxes, rising fuel costs, raises for their employees under a new union contract, or a variety of other sources of higher costs. By the same token, whenever costs come down for some reason, whether because of a tax cut or a technological improvement, for example, the question is often raised as to whether these lower costs will be passed on in lower prices to the consumers. The idea that sellers can charge whatever price they want is seldom expressed explicitly, but the implication that they can often lurks in the background of such questions as what they will pass on to their customers. But the passing on of either higher costs or savings in costs is not an automatic process, and in both cases, it depends on the kind of competition faced by each business and how many of the competing companies have the same cost increases or decreases. If you are running a gold mining company in South Africa and the government there increases the tax on gold by $10 an ounce, you cannot pass that on in higher prices to buyers of gold in the world market because gold producers in other countries do not have to pay that extra $10. To buyers around the world, gold is gold, wherever it is produced. There is no way that these buyers are going to pay $10 an ounce more for your gold than for somebody else's gold. Under these circumstances, a $10 tax on your gold means that your profits on gold sales in the world market will simply decline by $10 an ounce. The same principle applies when there are rising costs of transportation. If you ship your product to market by railroad and the railroads raise their freight charges, you can pass that on to the buyers only to the extent that your competitors also ship their product by rail. But if your competitors are shipping by truck or by barge, while your location will not allow you to do the same, then raising your prices to cover the additional rail charges will simply allow your competitors, with lower costs, to take away some of your customers by charging lower prices. On the other hand, if all your competitors ship by rail and for similar distances, then all of you can pass on the higher railroad freight charges to your customers. But if you ship your output of an average of 100 miles and your competitors ship their output an average of only 10 miles, then you can only raise your prices to cover the additional cost of rail charges for 10 miles and take a reduction in profit by the cost of the other 90 miles. Similar principles apply when it comes to passing on savings to customers. If you alone introduce a new technology that cuts your production costs in half, then you can keep all the additional profits resulting from these cost savings by continuing to charge what your higher cost competitors are charging. Alternatively, and this is what has often happened, you can cut your prices and take customers away from your competitors, which can lead to even larger total profits, despite lowering your profits per unit sold. Many of the great American fortunes, by Rockefeller, Carnegie, and others, came from finding lower cost ways of producing and delivering the product to the customer, and then charging lower prices than their higher cost competitors could meet, thus luring away their customers. Over a period of time, competitors usually begin to use similar technological or organizational advances to cut costs and reduce prices, but fortunes can be made by pioneering innovators in the meantime. That provides incentives for enterprises in profit-seeking market economies to be on the lookout for new ways of doing things, in contrast to enterprises in either government-run economies, like those in the days of the Soviet Union, or in economies where laws protect private businesses from domestic or international competition, as in India before they began to open their economy to competition in the world market.